You tried not to need things. Not because you didn't have needs, you did. You were a child. You had every need a child is supposed to have. But somewhere along the way, you learned that having those needs out loud, making them visible, asking for them to be met, that came at a cost. Not always a dramatic cost. Not always a door slamming or a voice raising. Sometimes it was quieter than that. A sigh. A pause that lasted too long. Eyes that looked away at just the wrong moment. A subtle shift in the air that told you, without words, that your presence had become inconvenient. This video is for you if you grew up feeling like your very existence was too much for the people who were supposed to want you. Not too loud, not too messy, not too demanding, just too much, simply by being there. And if that sentence landed somewhere in your chest just now, if something in you went still and quiet and strangely recognized, then stay with this, because what you're carrying has a name, and it's been carrying you without your permission for a very long time. There's a question that lives underneath everything we're going to talk about today. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. But it shapes the way you move through rooms, the way you shrink in relationships, the way you sometimes feel a low, dull guilt for wanting things that other people seem to want without thinking twice. That question is this: am I allowed to take up space? We're going to come back to that. Not to answer it the way a self-help book would, but to understand where it came from. Because before you can feel anything differently, you have to understand what you actually lived through. Not the story you've told yourself about it, not the version you softened to protect someone else, but the real, quiet, ordinary truth of what it was like to be you as a child in that house. You probably don't have a dramatic story. That's one of the strange things about this particular wound. It doesn't usually come wrapped in events that are easy to point to. There wasn't always a moment where someone said, in plain language, you are a burden. It was more like a texture, climate, the way a room felt when you walked into it and needed something, the way you learned to read faces before you even finished your sentence, the way you became, over time, a child who asked very little. Not because you were especially mature or easygoing or low maintenance, but because you had already learned what happened when you asked too much. And the thing is, the adults around you may not have even known they were doing it. That's what makes this so hard to hold. It's difficult to be angry at something that has no villain. It's difficult to grieve a wound that doesn't look like a wound from the outside. You look back and you think, they fed me, they kept a roof over my head. They weren't cruel in any obvious way. So why does it still feel like something was missing? Why does it still feel like something in me is waiting to be told it's okay to exist? Because what was missing wasn't food or shelter. What was missing was the kind of emotional presence that says, without words, in the way a parent's eyes soften when they see you, I am glad you are here. You are not too much. You are not inconvenient. You are wanted. That kind of message doesn't get delivered in a single conversation. It gets delivered over thousands of ordinary moments. A parent who asks about your day and actually waits to hear the answer. A parent who doesn't seem visibly burdened by your presence on a hard day. A parent who can hold your sadness or your frustration or your fear without pulling away or shutting down. These moments stack up over years, and what they build, or what their absence builds, becomes the foundation of how you understand yourself in relation to other people. And if those moments were inconsistent, if sometimes you were welcomed and sometimes you were too much, if sometimes your parent was warm and present and sometimes they were somewhere else entirely even when they were standing right in front of you, then you didn't learn that you were safe. You learned to monitor. You learned to track moods, to feel out the temperature of a room before you let yourself need anything in it. You learn to need quietly or not at all. Have you noticed that you still do this? That even now, in relationships where there is no evidence of danger, you find yourself scanning, watching, bracing for the moment when being too much becomes a problem. That's not a personality trait. That's not just who you are. That's a child who learned to survive. And the survival strategy was simple, even if the cost was enormous. Make yourself smaller. Need less. Offer more. Be useful, be easy, be low maintenance. Become someone who takes up just enough space to stay, but not so much space that you become a problem. You got very good at this. So good that it stopped feeling like a strategy and started feeling like identity. You stopped thinking I am hiding myself and started thinking this is just who I am. Person who doesn't need much. Person who manages. Person who is fine. But underneath fine, underneath the version of you that learned to disappear gracefully into the background of other people's lives, there was always a child who wanted to be chosen. Not tolerated. Not managed. Not accommodated. Chosen. Wanted. Welcomed simply for being there. And that child is still in there. Still waiting. Still watching for the moment when it becomes safe to stop shrinking. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to something very simple. A child cannot evaluate their environment objectively. A child cannot look at a stressed, emotionally unavailable, or overwhelmed parent and think, "This is about them, not about me." A child doesn't have that cognitive distance. A child's entire world is relational. It is organized around the central question of am I safe here, and am I loved here? And the answers to those questions don't come from logic. They come from the body, from the quality of touch, from the warmth or flatness in a voice, from whether the person who is supposed to be your home actually feels like home when you are standing inside them. So when a child feels like a burden, they don't conclude that their parent is struggling. They conclude that they, the child, are the problem. This isn't a thinking error. It's actually a kind of psychological protection. Because if the problem is the parent, if the person you need most in the world is unreliable or emotionally absent or resentful of your needs, then you are in danger. You are small and helpless and dependent on someone who cannot be counted on. That is an unbearable reality for a child's nervous system. But if the problem is you, if you are simply asking for too much, needing too much, being too much, then there is something you can do about it. You can change. You can shrink. You can become easier. And in becoming easier, you can keep yourself safe. The mind of a child will almost always choose a story in which they have some control, even if that story requires them to believe that they are fundamentally flawed, over a story in which they are helpless and at the mercy of someone unreliable. Fault, when it lives inside you, is at least workable. Fear, when it lives outside you and wears the face of someone you love, is not. So you took the fault in. You made it yours, not consciously, not in any way that a child would be able to name or explain, but in the slow, wordless way that children absorb the emotional reality of their homes. You took on the belief that your needs were a problem, that your presence required justification, that love was something you earned through your smallness rather than something you simply received for being alive. And your parents, most of them in most cases, were not monsters. That bears repeating because it matters. They were often people who were themselves carrying something heavy, stress or grief, or their own unhealed wounds, or a marriage that was struggling, or a mental landscape that didn't have room for a child's full emotional range. They were often doing what they understood love to look like, which was providing materially, physically, logistically, without necessarily knowing how to be emotionally present in the way a developing child needs. There is a particular kind of parent who is there and not there at the same time. Present in the room but absent in the ways that matter. Providing in the practical sense while being emotionally unreachable. And children who grow up with this kind of parent often end up more confused than children who experienced obvious neglect. Because at least obvious neglect has a shape. At least it's legible. But when a parent is sometimes warm and sometimes a closed door, sometimes available and sometimes somewhere else entirely behind their eyes, the child doesn't know which version of reality to trust. They don't know if love is real or conditional or simply inconsistent. And in the absence of that certainty, they do the only thing that makes sense. They make themselves responsible. Did you ever find yourself as a child trying to fix the mood in a room you walked into? Trying to make a parent laugh when they seemed heavy? Trying to disappear quietly when the atmosphere felt fragile? Trying to be a certain version of yourself, easier, sunnier, lower maintenance, depending on what the adult in front of you seemed to need? That was not you being a good child. That was you being a parentified one. Parentification is a word that sounds clinical, but what it describes is something very human and very painful. It describes a child who learned to take responsibility for the emotional well-being of the adults around them. A child who learned to caretake rather than be cared for. A child who grew up too quickly not because they were ready, but because something in their environment required it of them. And the cost of that early growing up is not always visible in childhood. In childhood, it might have even looked like a strength. You were so mature, so easy, so thoughtful, so good at reading people. Adults probably appreciated it. They may have even leaned into it. Leaning on you, confiding in you, treating you more like a small adult than a child who still needed protecting. And you took that role seriously because being needed felt safer than being too much. Being useful felt more secure than being simply loved. But being needed and being loved are not the same thing. You can be endlessly useful to someone and still feel profoundly invisible to them. You can be the most reliable, low-maintenance, emotionally self-sufficient person in every room you enter and still go home at night with that quiet, exhausting ache of not being truly seen. Because what you learn to offer, competence, ease, emotional management, is not the same as what you needed to receive. And the part of you that needed to receive something, that needed to be held rather than useful, witnessed rather than praised for your adaptability, that part never stopped needing it. It just learned to be quiet about it. It learned to be quiet in the same way you once learned to be quiet in that house. Carefully, expertly, in a way that looks from the outside like peace. Here is what it looks like now. Not in your childhood. In your life today. You might notice that you apologize before you ask for things. Not dramatically, just a small, habitual softening. Sorry to bother you, but... Or you preface a need with an explanation of why it's reasonable, why it won't take long, why you wouldn't ask at all except that you really can't manage this one alone. As if your need requires a legal defense before it's allowed to exist. You might notice that you find it genuinely difficult to receive. Someone offers you help and something in you wants to deflect it, minimize it, turn it back around. You say, oh, don't worry about me, not because you don't need help but because accepting help means admitting that you need something. And needing something still feels, somewhere underneath the logic, like a liability. You might notice that in relationships you are often the one who gives more. Not because no one offers, but because you are more comfortable in the position of offering. Receiving love, receiving care, receiving someone's full and undivided attention directed at you and your needs. That can feel strangely uncomfortable, exposing, like you're asking for something you haven't earned yet. You learn to earn love, not the idea of it. You probably know intellectually that love isn't supposed to be a transaction. But in your body, in the part of you that learned before language, love has always been something that comes after. After you've been useful, after you've been easy, after you've made yourself into someone who causes no trouble. Love as reward rather than love as given. And so you give. You give time and energy and presence and patience. You give before you're asked because waiting to be asked feels too much like demanding. You give until you are empty, and then you find a way to give a little more because stopping feels dangerous. Like if you stop being useful, you stop being wanted. Like if you stop performing the role of easy, undemanding, grateful to be here, someone will finally notice what you were always afraid was true. That you are, at bottom, too much trouble. Have you noticed how tired this makes you? Not just physically. Something deeper than physical. A kind of existential fatigue that comes from spending years managing your own presence, monitoring your own needs, translating your own feelings into something more palatable before you let them out into the world. You became fluent in other people's emotional languages long before you developed one of your own. You can read a room in seconds. You can sense a shift in someone's mood before they've consciously registered it themselves. You can tell by the way a person holds their silence, whether it's a comfortable silence or a loaded one. These are not small skills. They are the result of years of careful, necessary attention to the people around you. But they came at a cost. And the cost was that you spent so much energy attending to others that attending to yourself became a kind of foreign country. Familiar in theory, hard to actually inhabit. You might notice that when someone asks how you are, really asks with genuine attention, you feel a brief, disorienting blankness. Like the question doesn't quite compute. Because for so long, how you are wasn't really the point. The point was how useful you could be, how easy, how present for someone else. The question of your own interior experience got filed away so consistently, so automatically, that retrieving it now requires effort that doesn't come naturally. And underneath all of this, underneath the giving, the monitoring, the apologizing, the reflexive self-erasure, there is something that might be the most painful part of all of this to sit with. You are not sure you believe that you deserve to be here just as you are. Not as the helpful one. Not as the easy one. Not as the one who doesn't complain, doesn't demand, doesn't ask for too much. Just as yourself. Unperforming. Unedited. Simply present and taking up space and not justifying it. That belief, or rather the absence of it, is the thread that runs through everything. The cost of this is not abstract. It shows up in the texture of your daily life in ways that are easy to miss because they have become so ordinary. It shows up in your relationships, not always in dramatic ways, but in quiet patterns that repeat. You tend to attract or to stay longest with people who need a lot from you. Not because you seek them out consciously, but because being needed activates something familiar. Being needed means there is a reason for you to be there. Being needed means the relationship has a clear structure, one that you understand, one in which your role is legible and your value is not in question. When someone needs you, you know what to do. When someone simply loves you, without agenda, without needing anything in particular, simply choosing to be near you, that can feel almost harder to trust. Because love without a transaction is love you haven't earned yet. And love you haven't earned yet feels, at some cellular level, like love that can be taken back. So you find yourself sometimes subtly uncomfortable in relationships that are actually healthy, waiting for the other shoe to drop, scanning for signs that the person has finally seen how much trouble you really are, doing extra, being more available, more accommodating, more patient than you probably need to be, as a kind of preemptive insurance against abandonment. As if by being enough, you can prevent the inevitable conclusion that you were always afraid of, that you were never quite worth the effort. You might also notice this cost in the way you relate to your own success, your own ambitions, your own dreams. There can be a quiet guilt around wanting things for yourself, around taking up space in the world in a way that is visible, that makes noise, that asks to be seen. Achievement can feel uncomfortable not because you don't want it, but because wanting it feels selfish, and selfish, somewhere in your nervous system, is still synonymous with dangerous. Selfish is what children were when they needed too much. Selfish is what you were afraid of being. So you learn to want things apologetically, to pursue things quietly, to minimize your own aspirations in company as though downplaying them protects you from something, though it's hard to say exactly what. And there is the inner conflict, the one that is perhaps most exhausting of all. The conflict between the part of you that is so tired of performing smallness, and the part of you that is genuinely terrified of what happens if you stop. Because you have been small for a long time. And small has kept you safe in the way that hiding keeps you safe. It has protected you from being seen as too much, from being rejected for your needs, from the particular shame of asking for something and watching someone's face register that you have asked for too much. Small has been a reliable strategy. And the problem with reliable strategies is that they become load-bearing walls. You don't know what the structure looks like if you remove them. So you stay caught between two versions of yourself. The version that knows intellectually, rationally, in the calm light of a good day, that you are allowed to exist fully, that your needs are legitimate, that taking up space is not a crime, that being loved should not require you to be invisible first. That version of you can say all the right things and even believe them for a little while. And then there is the other version, the version that lives below the rational mind, in the body, in the old reflexes, the version that still flinches slightly when you need something in front of someone, the version that monitors, that braces, that keeps one eye on the door in every room, not because you plan to leave, but because knowing where the exit is has always felt like the only kind of safety you could count on. These two versions of you are not in conflict because something is wrong with you. They are in conflict because you are holding two different truths at the same time. The truth of what you know now, and the truth of what you learned then. And what you learned then was learned by a child, in conditions that no longer exist, for reasons that had nothing to do with your actual worth. But knowing that, even fully, even clearly, doesn't always make the old truth loosen its grip. Because it isn't stored where knowledge is stored. It isn't in your thoughts. It's in the way your body tightens when someone seems annoyed with you. It's in the way your voice gets smaller when you want something. It's in the way you hold yourself in rooms where you haven't yet been told, explicitly, that you are welcome. You weren't born knowing how to disappear. You learned it, and anything that was learned can, in time, be unlearned, not through force, not through willpower, not through telling yourself to simply stop, but through something slower and more patient than that, through the gradual, tender, sometimes unglamorous work of learning what it feels like to stay. This is not the part where everything gets resolved. If you came here looking for a list of things to do, a set of steps that will dismantle the old belief and install a new one, this is not that. Not because those things don't exist, but because that's not what this particular moment is for. What this moment is for is something quieter than fixing. Something that has to come before fixing, if any of it is going to mean anything at all. It's for understanding what actually happened to you, not the version you minimized to protect someone else's reputation. Not the version where you decided it wasn't that bad, wasn't worth naming, wasn't a big enough thing to justify the weight you've been carrying. The actual version. The one where a child, you needed to be told through 1,000 ordinary moments that they were wanted, and those moments were missing, or inconsistent, or conditional in ways that a child's heart is not built to withstand. That happened. It was real. And it shaped you in ways that were entirely logical given what you were working with. Here is something worth sitting with. The strategies you developed were not weaknesses. They were intelligence. The hypervigilance, the people-pleasing, the self-erasure, the compulsive giving, none of these things arose because something was defective in you. They arose because something was missing around you, and you were a child who needed to survive in that environment, and you found ways to do it. Remarkably effective ways in many cases. You learned to read people. You learned to adapt. You learned to be someone others found easy to be around, which kept you connected, which kept you from the particular loneliness of being truly unwanted. These were not failures of character. They were feats of survival. The problem is not that you developed them. The problem is that they have outlasted the conditions that required them. You are not a child anymore. You are not in that house anymore. The people whose moods you learn to manage are not the only people available to you anymore. And yet, the nervous system does not automatically receive that update. The nervous system keeps running the old software because the old software kept you alive, and the nervous system is conservative that way. It does not abandon a working strategy simply because the threat that required it has passed. So you are not broken. You are running an outdated program in a present that has moved on without it. And the reframe, if there is one, and it is a gentle one offered without pressure, is simply this: the belief that you are too much, that your needs are a problem, that you must earn your right to exist in any room you enter. That belief did not come from truth. It came from a particular environment at a particular time, absorbed by a child who had no other frame of reference. Felt like truth because it was all you knew. It organized your entire understanding of yourself and your place in the world. But a belief that was built from the outside in can, over time, be examined from the inside out. Not forced, not rushed, not dismantled in a single insight or a single conversation or even a single year, but examined, questioned, held up gently to the light and asked, is this actually true? Or is this something I was taught to believe by someone who was too overwhelmed, too absent, too wounded themselves to show me something different? You might notice, as you sit with that question, that the answer is not as clean as you'd like it to be. Because some part of you has been living inside that belief for so long that questioning it doesn't immediately feel like freedom. Can feel at first like losing a floor. Like if you stop believing you are too much, you don't know what the shape of yourself looks like anymore. You have organized so much of your life around that belief, around managing it, compensating for it, working around it, that releasing it is not simply a relief. It is also a kind of grief. Grief for the years spent small. Grief for the needs that went unmet and unspoken. Grief for the version of yourself that deserved to be held and wasn't, that deserved to be wanted without conditions and wasn't, that came into the world with the full rightful hunger of a human child and was quietly, consistently taught to be ashamed of it. That grief is not weakness. That grief is accuracy. It is the appropriate response to something real that was lost. and it deserves to be felt. Not performed, not rushed through, not resolved on a timeline. Just felt quietly and honestly, in the way that real things deserve to be felt. You were not too much. You were in the wrong environment for who you actually were. You are allowed to be here. Not the useful version of you. Not the easy version. Not the version that has already calculated how much space it's safe to take up in this particular room, with these particular people on this particular day. Just you. The full, unedited, still figuring it out version of you. You are allowed to need things. Not because you've earned it through years of low maintenance, self-sufficient, uncomplaining presence, though you have abundantly, but because needing things is what being human is. It is not a design flaw. It is not an imposition. It is not evidence that you are too much. It is simply what it means to be alive and embodied and in relationship with other people. The child who learned to be small was doing something real and necessary. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how. He was keeping himself safe in an environment that required him to be invisible. They were surviving with the creativity and resourcefulness that children use when the world doesn't offer them a safer option. That child deserves your compassion, not your frustration, not your impatience, not the quiet contempt that says, "Why can't I just get over this?" Compassion, the kind that recognizes that what happened was real, and that real things leave real marks, and that healing is not about erasing the marks but about understanding them well enough that they no longer run everything. The question we started with, "Am I allowed to take up space?" does not have an answer that can be given to you by another person. Not by a parent who finally comes through, not by a partner who loves you loudly enough, not by a therapist or a video or a book. Those things can help. They can offer language for what you've been carrying. They can reflect something back to you that begins to loosen the old belief at its edges. But the answer itself, the felt, embodied, unshakable knowing that you are allowed to be here, that one has to be built slowly from the inside through the accumulation of moments where you stayed when you would have shrunk, where you asked when you would have gone without, where you let yourself be seen when hiding would have been easier. It is built through the small, unglamorous, daily practice of treating your own presence as something worth protecting. Not fighting for, not justifying, not endlessly explaining and softening and making palatable. Just protecting, the way you would protect someone you loved, the way you would have protected that child if you could go back. With the simple, steady insistence that they are here, and they are allowed to be here, and that is enough of a reason. You were not too much. You were not a burden. You were a child who needed more than you were given. And that truth, quiet, unglamorous, and entirely yours, is the place where something new can finally begin to grow. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, and for real.